and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nyambura and this is 100 on Books. I live in a society, there are people outside. So today I'm going to be talking about the books I finished in the week ending 7th April 2023. The first of those was You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People by Aubrey Gordon, narrated by the author. So Aubrey Gordon, some of you may know her as Your Fat Friend. She tweets and posts as Your Fat Friend, and she's also the co-host of Maintenance Phase, which is a podcast that discusses some of these ideas around the cultural atmosphere in the US at the very least that leads to fat phobia and certain attitudes towards fat people or larger people. So this book tackles some of those myths around fatness and fat people. You can just lose weight, it's all about calories in, calories out, etc, etc, etc. If you have a history of, say, disordered eating and so on, it may be the sort of book that brings up certain very strong feelings. But I found it was an interesting look at especially American dieting culture and American attitudes towards fatness and larger bodies and so on. If you listen to her podcast or read any of her blog posts and so on, the content is going to be very familiar, so it will feel like ground that's being retread. But if this is your first introduction to some of the ways in which she handles these ideas and so on, I think it's going to be a good read. I will commend it for the fact that she constantly references black authors who have tackled the particular, and I think I've mentioned this before, anti-blackness that's baked into fat phobia, especially in the US. So on the whole, as I said, it's a good book. Next, I listened to Another Appalachia, Growing Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place by Nima Avashia, which is narrated by Jid Sadi. I first heard about this book via Twitter and I put a hold on it, and it felt like, oh wait, first I did not put a hold on it because there didn't seem to be any copies at the libraries that I have cards at. But then when it became a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for lesbian memoir, suddenly there was an audiobook copy, so I put a hold on it and it came in. Actually, I just borrowed it because it seemed nobody had put a hold on it, but as I said, it had newly arrived. And this is a collection of essays where she examines her life as a queer Indian descended person. Like, her parents came from India and went to live in West Virginia, and her father worked for Union Carbide. This is very important if you know the history of Union Carbide in India, because they were the company behind the Bhopal disaster, which I'll just put a link to an article or a video that talks about it. But because her father was Indian from India, he was tied up in that disaster in a very particular way, and yet he stayed loyal to the company throughout his time working there, because they had been his means of having a foothold in America, in American society. So she interrogates this particular position as a brown person in a white majority place, as a person who found love and care and family amongst people who are sometimes racist, are sometimes anti-immigrant, categories which affect, biases which affect her as a person and her family. And I found it a very generous memoir, but I also want to say that I am finding, and I think this is something that I had a conversation with my brother about, because he said, oh, you seem to keep talking about how you don't like memoirs, but keep reading memoirs. I'm finding that I love memoirs in essays because they don't sag under the weight of continuous narrative. Each of them can stand alone and they don't have to tie into each other tidily, a bit like the way I'm finding that I love the idea of a novel in interconnected short stories, for instance. So I have here in my notes that a huge part of this memoir is essays where Avashia really grapples with those contradictions that come with having grown up in this place, having lived her formative years in this place, but also now living on the East Coast. She lives in Boston, she teaches there and so on. She is in a partnership with a white Jewish woman, and that also brings up its own contradictions, and figuring out what all of those things mean to her and her sense of self and her sense of her place in the world. So quite enjoyed that. Next was Wandering Souls by Cecile Pong, narrated by Aoife Hines, Iona Kimbuk, and Ainsley Barber. When I tell you I had to look up the pronunciations of all of those names again because I had mangled them when I did buy Maktaba Manenos. I'm going to put a link to the Maktaba Manenos where I talk about this book. But anyway, I did this. I listened and read this, so this was a hybrid read. And it's a really fast read which tackles the life of one family of Vietnamese child refugees who live in the UK, and it follows them from their departure from Vietnam through to their time in Hong Kong before they are placed in the UK. The UK is their third country, as it's called in the world of, like forced migration, which is to say like refugees and so on. And I will say that before this novel, I had never actually thought of the UK as a place where Vietnamese refugees went, because I'd read Kim Thuy, who is a Vietnamese Canadian writer. I knew that there was a Vietnamese diaspora there. I knew that there's a Vietnamese diaspora in the US, and not just because of reading Ocean Vuong. I think the US was one of the largest recipients of Vietnamese refugees in the wake of the Vietnamese War, which I think is just right, honestly. If you cause chaos, you should handle the repercussions of that chaos. And I also knew, because of reading Year of the Rabbit by Tian Veasna last year, that France had received a number of Vietnamese refugees, which again also makes sense because France had been a colonial power in Vietnam, and so they had historical ties, which I always find those ties that are tied to imperial histories being called historical ties. It's like it really elides the violence that comes with colonialism and so on, but that's not what we're here for. And so we follow this one family, 3 children. We actually see this story from the perspective of the oldest child, who is a girl and who ends up taking care of her 2 younger brothers. They manage to make a life for themselves in the UK. It's not the life they imagined they would have. It's not the life their parents imagined they would have when they sent them out as refugee children. And while they navigate grief and so on, and there's also the added complication of the fact that their parents wanted them to go to the US. This is a thing that's a thread in the novel, but because of a decision in a moment by the oldest child, they end up in the UK. But they talk about, the novel really tackles in a really short period of time what it's like to live in this place where you're unwanted, where, for instance, Margaret Thatcher, because a thread in the novel is one character going back to historical documents and seeing how Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister during the time when a lot of Vietnamese refugees were being resettled in the UK, was unwelcoming of these refugees because of racism more than anything else. And so what it is to live in a country that's unwelcoming because of your race, while it's also being complicated by the crisis of that particular time. As you may recall, Thatcher was Prime Minister during the miners' strike and so on, and she was a key part of really breaking down the strong union presence in the UK. And as I said, this factors into the lives of these refugees and this particular family. And so we really see them navigate all of these factors in British society, and towards the end, living in a society that, as with all of these Western societies, suddenly it's like, oh, we love the food of brown and black people, which 2-3 decades ago one would be harassed for consuming, and so we see this happening on a societal scale, but also on a familial scale. And as I said, it was such a punchy novel, it was such a moving novel. I should also mention that there is a voice of a dead relative in the course of the novel, which is usually something that takes me out of a novel, but it really added some texture to the storytelling that I greatly enjoyed. there's construction work happening next door, if you can hear hammering and so on. So that's Wandering Souls by Cecil Pan. Oh, I forgot to mention that this book has been longlisted for the Women's Prize. That's not why I read it. I'd put it on hold way before that because I'd been seeing all of this good chatter on Twitter, but I enjoyed reading it. Next is A Son to Be Sewn by Jean d'Amérique, translated by Thierry Kehoe and narrated by Marie-Françoise Theodore. It's set in Haiti. It follows in Haiti. It follows this girl as she, moves through her life as a working class girl, living in a particularly poor neighborhood in Port-au-Prince, and then she moves to the US. I want to say more, but I can't because I listened to this at 2x and I also drifted in and out of sleep. So, because of this, even though I'm talking about it now, I borrowed the ebook also and I extended the loan on the audiobook. So, I'll probably be talking about it in the next few weeks. Just talk about the experience of really paying close attention to it because that's a thing I saw on Storygraph and Goodreads people saying, hey, this is the sort of book where you need to pay really close attention to what's going on in the novel, and I don't feel like I did it justice. So I'll say no more about this book. Next was The Intimacy Experiment by Rosie Danan, which is the second in the Shameless series, and it was narrated by Alex McKenna and Khalil Griffith. This book follows a retired porn star who finds herself in a situation where she's giving lectures on intimacy at a synagogue whose attendance has been flagging. So the rabbi asks her if she can come in and basically attract a younger crowd. And she says yes, sure, why not? But she's also in the process really being forced to confront some ideas about intimacy, about faith that have come from her particular history and her familial history and so on. And then she ends up in a relationship with the rabbi. They have like a mutual attraction, etc. And some of the ideas in the lecture series that she has about intimacy are playing out in their relationship. How does one navigate values? How does one navigate talking about certain tough topics with the person who they're dating, etc. This novel was very didactic. Very didactic. I remember my friend MJ, I've mentioned her a lot of times on this channel, so we all know who MJ is by now. But MJ, when she saw that I was reading this book, was like, okay, I want to hear your thoughts because I had to give up on it at some point. The thing is, it wasn't the sort of slow-going novel that makes me want to put it down. Slow doesn't actually usually make me want to DNF things. I know you're wondering, what makes you want to DNF things? Honestly, at this point, it's clear. Nothing makes me want to DNF things. But, it was very slow-going. It was very didactic. There are times when I'd just be like, we get it, you're teaching us these things about how to handle heartbreak or how to handle a relationship and so on. But when are you going to kiss? This was framed as a romance. What is this? What is going on here? Of course, there's a third act breakup that was very sauceless. Honestly, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I don't like third act breakups, and people please flag books with third act breakups so that I can stay away from them. So between the fact that there was practically no theme, it was very didactic. It felt very much like an extended listicle on how to navigate relationships, and I'm going to put a link below to how to navigate relationships to a really great podcast episode from a podcast that has now been archived called Identity Politics Pod, that was hosted by two Muslim women, and then they had this lady come in who talked about how we've been taught to have certain ideas about what it means to get into a long-term romantic relationship, but maybe we need to shift these ideas. And yes, they were framed by a certain Islamic school of thought, but I found them really useful even as a person who barely has any religious practice. So I'm going to put a link to that below. And I will say this, that podcast episode does the work this book thinks it's doing without pretending to be a romantic novel. Okay, so it's not a bad novel, but don't go in expecting lots of romance, etc, etc, etc. go in expecting basically like a lot of extended teenage angst, because for me it was a bit ironic that the FMC, the female main character, is a person who's been in therapy, and so she has been in spaces in which she's confronting herself and some of her ideas and so on. But it doesn't come through in the way she interacts with the MMC or in the way she moves through the world. And it's just, anyway, I actually wrote this in my notes. Slow and didactic. That's it. Next, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality by Jane Watt, narrated by Dara Rosenberg. I picked this up because there's a thread on Twitter about this idea of heterosexual squalor, and this book always comes up in the comments like, oh my gosh, especially when I read The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, etc. So I put it on hold, and then it finally came through. And when I tell you this book is full of this rose-tinted idea of queerness, I will say this, and I say this as a person who, I ride hard for the alphabet community. You know, LGBTQIA plus people to the front at all times. But this is not, I'm not talking about the book, I'm talking about the LGBTQIA community. It's not this monolith that's full of people who are really just really great at handling relationships, handling kink, etc. If we disregard the racism, the fatphobia, the classism, and so on that occurs in the queer community, we're doing it an injustice. And yet, this book's premise is basically like, straight people don't even know how bad it is because we know how great we're having it. And it's like, are we having it great? No. Let's talk about it. You know? So basically, like, this black and white thinking is a really boring way of moving through the world. I'm just going to say it. Okay, I actually put that in the notes. Boring! Because it's like, okay, so queer people have a lot of room for exploring, say, kink, or exploring quote-unquote non-traditional relationships. So, you know, like polyamory, or there's supposedly room, say, for asexuality and so on. But is it that simple? And is it one of those things where, like, we have to make one side look good in order to critique another side? Like, it's a bit like leftist discourse, so it's like, the right, ABCD, and it's like, take some time and really interrogate yourselves, girls. Okay? So, that's one thing. Another thing for me is that because it was based on, like, Western society, and not just Western society, like a very particular white American idea of heterosexuality, there are certain themes that just ran through the book. It's just really like, if I were to distill the basic thesis of the book, it's basically straight people hate each other, and they have to be trained to at least pretend to like each other, or they have to be trained to like each other because they are not socialized to like each other. At the very heart of heterosexual relationships is a mutual disregard for each other. And let me tell you something. I mean, I know that's part of what shows up, for instance, in romance novels, which is this idea that this is a couple that has gone beyond this heterosexual idea of my boyfriend, my girlfriend, to actually liking each other and being enthusiastic about each other. But because it positions itself as, I don't want to say a definitive book at straightness, but like a book that's going to say very strong things about straightness, I don't think it leaves room for all the ways in which straightness is present in the world. Like, there are many ways of being straight, and the white American way is not the only way. And I think she acknowledges this because every so often Ward will be like, well, you know, amongst black people, straightness has this cachet that comes with it being an institution that they can plug into, unlike, say, class mobility and so on and so forth. But then she pivots right back to that white, I'm going to say this middle upper class idea of heterosexuality that's just so boring. And I think reading it in the same week as You Just Need to Lose Weight was really jarring because unlike Aubrey Gordon, who gives room to the voices of POC, who every so often is like, hey, I'm not the definitive voice on this. Like, please read these books. Please listen to these voices, etc. Jane Ward is like, I said what I said. And it's like, I don't want to silence women, but a bit of it is like, Also, she talked a bit about like, the choice to be a lesbian, the choice to be queer and how it can be liberating and so on. And straight women make jokes about this, say on Twitter and places like those every so often, like, when I see how bad the dating market is, I know that being straight is not a choice, etc, etc, etc. So there's a bit of it that's like, we need to acknowledge where people are coming from when we're talking to them. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think straight women are dying to be treated with disrespect. No. Or are dying to be regarded by their husbands and boyfriends as this thing around their neck, etc, etc. But I don't know. It just did not sit right with me. So I'm not going to speak any further about this book. Lastly, I listened to and read Year of the Tiger, An Activist's Life by Alice Wong, which is narrated by Nancy Wu. This is a hybrid read and I really enjoyed it. So I picked this up because Alice Wong was the editor of Disability Visibility, which I absolutely enjoyed. It's a collection of essays by different disabled writers. And in this book, Alice Wong's voice really comes through. Very, very righteous rage. A lot of righteous rage is what I'm looking for. Very whimsical, very fun also. It was such a great idea to also pick up the ebook, because when you listen to the audiobook, the book references a lot of, like the graphics in the ebook. And so it was nice to be looking at them. Just really beautiful drawings and a great way of interrogating what it means to live in the world as a disabled person of color in the global north, in the US specifically, with the particular complications that come with living in a country that doesn't like disabled people. I would say that's a lot of the world, to be honest. So you might have some accommodations, for instance, but on the whole, it's almost like the system doesn't want you around. And because this book also stretches into the pandemic, it's a collection of essays that stretch into the pandemic. It really talks about how it was a jarring experience for Wong and for her comrades, for her, fellow disabled people, to be living in a mass disabling period, and yet see people, non-disabled people, so anxious to go back to normal life, which for disabled people, for a lot of disabled people, was a life that excluded them, excluded people who are deaf, excluded people who are physically disabled, who have mobility issues for one reason or the other. And so, and also to see something like the pandemic be the justifying reason for disabled people to really be cast aside, these people can be vaccinated, for instance, and disabled people are at the very bottom of the list, even though some of them, by virtue of their disability, like in the case of Alice Wong, really needed the vaccine. So navigating those, issues, the particular hurt and anger that comes with being disabled in a world that prioritizes non-disabled people and, as I said, wants to discard disabled people, while living a life that prioritizes joy, fun, community, and so on. I really, really enjoyed this, and I don't say this often on this channel, but this is one of those books I'd love to get my hands on and just, keep going back to these illustrations and so on. I will say this because my loan ended towards the end, but there was nobody, waiting for the ebook. I renewed my loan just so that I can take screenshots of some of those beautiful illustrations before I get a hand on the physical book. And that's all the books I finished in the week ending 7th April 2023. Please let me know which books you finished during this week, or which books you've enjoyed this year. Which books, if you're a library reader, would you like to buy a copy of, so I can keep visiting and so on. Another book I'd like to buy a copy of is Wandering Souls by Cecile Pong, because it's just so well written and it's something I'd like to sit with for a long time. So please like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll be seeing you soon. Bye.